So a great friend of the show, Kyle Kulinkski, he's been very clear about why he is unlikely to vote for Joe Biden in spite of facing a lot of pressure to do exactly that. He's laid out what his criteria is, why Joe Biden doesn't meet it. He's been very specific about rejecting the lesser of two evils or vote blue no matter who standard. Well, he seems to be rethinking that position as frankly as I have been this week as well. He explained some of his thinking on his show yesterday. Let's take a listen.
So that's why I was 98% certain. Like, no, I'm not going to vote for Biden. He doesn't meet even my very, very lenient standards. But now I feel like the game changed, and being totally honest with you guys, walking you through my thought process, now I'm 50-50 as to whether or not I vote for him. And the reason I say that is, it actually may be the case that the stakes are, this guy is against the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and wants to effectively eliminate it by deploying the U.S. military on U.S. soil. That's Trump. And Biden, even if you grant that he's bad on this issue and he would deploy more police or he would deploy the National Guard, that is categorically different and not nearly as bad as deploying the U.S. military on U.S. soil. That is not a destruction of the First Amendment. And that, my friends, is a giant, crucial difference where there is no equivalence between the two candidates.
And, you know, I mean, frankly, yeah, it is interesting. I'm going to bet that Kyle is not alone in that way. In fact, I know he's not alone because I feel the same way. I mean, you know, I've been very reluctant to get behind Biden because his role in the Iraq War, his role in just the ascendant neoliberal wing in the party, his law and order, frankly, quote unquote, you know, role in mass incarceration. I think he's been on the wrong side, the pro-free trade, the NAFTA, TPP. I mean, all of these things, in my view, he's been on the wrong side. And so even though I never thought that he and Trump were equivalent, I do feel that, you know, he was beyond the pale, but he was outside of what I could really get behind and affirmatively vote for. Two things in my view have happened. I mean, like Kyle, I share the view that what Trump suggested with the Insurrection Act and sending the U.S. military into our streets to quash peaceful protesters, and I know you could say, oh, it's just going to be the bad ones, but we saw before our eyes as, you know, protesters that the president has now shared a letter basically, you know, insinuating they're terrorists were quashed with tear gas, with rubber bullets, with flashbang grenades. Church ladies, activists, journalists, whoever was in the way, quashed so that he can have this photo op. So in my view, the idea that you're going to send the military in and they're just going to be able to focus on the peaceful protests and protect everyone's First Amendment right, it's ludicrous to me looking at that. And look, he might not do it this time because now the protests have turned mostly peaceful. So he may not ultimately send the military in. But what about next time? You know, what's the next excuse? What's the next breakdown or protest that's inconvenient that he doesn't like, that would call for such authoritarian, you know, anti-democratic, anti-constitutional approach? That to me really does shift the calculus because yes, Joe Biden under the Obama administration, you know, they quashed peaceful protesters at Standing Rock, and he is more conservative on these issues than I am, but he's within the bounds of sort of mainstream democratic, what I would consider appropriate or acceptable debate or thought. There's another piece for me, though, too, Saagar, which is that, you know, obviously Joe Biden is who he is. We have a long record. We know what he stands for. He's promised us nothing's fundamentally going to change, and we should take him at his word. However, you have people in the streets in a way that I've never seen before in my lifetime. And you know that Trump is going to be completely unresponsive to them. He's not going to do one thing that they want. And not only that, is going to seek to crush them and try to quash their speech, because that's what we've seen him do. We know he's not going to be responsive and he's just going to try to quash them. Biden, on the other hand, is at least trying to incorporate, he is subject to some pressure, right? He is subject to
pressure. Right, because he's part of the
coalition
at the end of the day.
He's part of the coalition. And this is 78% support, you know, the protesters. So it's very much the mainstream of America. Since he is part of that coalition, since he depends on them for his political support, he will be somewhat responsive, at least to the demands that are coming out of this movement. So it's not just that, in my view, Trump has become worse and even more unacceptable and has committed maybe the worst act of his presidency, in my view. It's also that because of the protesters in the streets, I actually think Biden's presidency will be somewhat better than it would have been before. So for me, it's both of those pieces.
So I think that's interesting. It's very much a Flight 93 calculus, and I don't begrudge or judge anybody for holding that position. I guess I think I want to explain that just as an equal explanation, or as just an equal force that it's exerted, I think on the progressive left, it feels very much so on the, I guess, the Trump right or the nationalist right, which is that you kind of have seen a much more hardening in the position where, people ask, how can you put up with, the co-opting of the administration by so many corporates? How can you, put up with X or Y or Z, or he didn't fulfill this promise? And it's the existential nature exactly of the way that you're talking about is that what puts people into the mindset of, I'm going to have to just support this person, the way that you're talking about Biden. I'm not saying you are. I know Kyle is also at 50-50, and I know that is something that people are on the fence by, but it certainly has opened up that space. And I think that it needs to be understood that it's exactly the same case on the right of the party, because you also saw something that happened in Minneapolis yesterday. The Minneapolis City Council, I'm reading from a tweet here on my phone, says that the Minneapolis Police Department will be dismantled and replaced with a, quote, transformative new model of public safety. Now, I think that some of the people who watch this show probably agree with that, and I know some of the people don't. But it's these types of, I would say, eroding or, attack on institutions, which, places like police departments and others, that makes it a culture war issue that digs people in. So just as much of it you'll dig in, people like you, people like Kyle and others, it will also make, anti-corporate people on the right who hold different cultural views and especially different views on policing and on law and order and on, the way in which you respond to violence kind of in our society and, views on military and de-escalation and more kind of hardened in their own views. And I think that's why the dynamic is so different this time around. And the Flight 93 calculus, I think, it in a strange way exists for both sides. And it wasn't that case last time for Democrats with Hillary Clinton. But I see, in the way that you've had to respond to this, and Kyle, and like I said, I respect anybody's opinion, that calculus is beginning to take hold a little bit more. And I think that just makes for a very different election dynamic than the one we had before, when we just had the coronavirus crisis that was happening here.
Yeah. And, honestly, Trump had an opportunity. I think we have a different view on this and the political implications. I think this has been a horrific response from Trump. I think it's not only divided the country, but I think some of his weaker supporters have been shaken off. I think people like me and Kyle, who were, not really planning to vote for Joe Biden, are taking another look. I think he is firming up Joe Biden's support and increasing enthusiasm for that choice in real time. But also, he had a real opportunity with both coronavirus and now with George Floyd's killing and Breonna Taylor, by the way, and Ahmaud Arbery and the protests and uprisings that have sprung up across the country. He had a real opportunity here to not just, skim by and stick with this base and harden support among a core few, but to actually have a response that people could get behind and respect. And that was available to him. I mean, look, there's a certain core of the Democratic Party that is absolutely never, ever, ever going to think a single thing that Donald Trump does is good. Never, right? And I get that. Honestly, I understand it. I get it. But in a crisis, people really do look to their president and they want to see leadership and they want to see the best in their country. And we didn't see that in coronavirus. And I always use the example, Andrew Cuomo had a crappy response to coronavirus, but he was at least able to project confidence and competence and authority and calm. And that was enough for people because they want to look to their leaders. DeWine in Ohio, same thing, Republican. And has very high support. He actually did do a competent job, unlike Cuomo, but because of that, he handled it well. And so I think there was a similar opportunity with the George Floyd killing. And you saw Trump reaching for some of that early on, sympathy with the family and reaching for unifying language and calling for an investigation and those sorts of things. And as the protests escalated, he went in the total opposite direction of this hard line, in my view, authoritarian crackdown, which has split off, not only I think some of his looser supporters, but have hardened the Biden support. And, the politics of it in some ways is the least important part. The morality of it, the justice of it, what it does to the country is the most important point. But in terms of politics, I personally think it's been an abject disaster that you have so many military leaders, his own Secretary of Defense coming out and saying this isn't the right approach. This isn't what I want. This isn't called for. I think that this has been just a disaster for him ultimately politically. And we see that in the poll that we covered of evangelical support, even kind of shaken from their very high previous approval ratings of him.
Sure. So I would agree with you up until a point, especially on the corona point. But I think that on the protest side, it was the moment that the violence began, the rioting and the looting in particular, that is what changed the dynamic. And I've been very critical of much of the left's response here because I do think that they were sitting on a moment and had created a political space where 97% of the country agreed that George Floyd was murdered in cold blood by those officers and wanted to see justice. And that when it became a culture war issue around rioting, looting, and the way that you deal with violence in our society, that is when things kind of went off the rails, and whenever Trump and people really became hardened in their position on the way to look at it. So I would basically just reject that framing on the protests. And I think a lot of the onus, look, Trump is not a unifying figure. I don't think he ever wanted to be, and I don't think he desires to be. And I'm very critical of that, especially whenever it came to the corona response. And even, sure, look, on the Floyd response and the photo op, I think it was a political disaster. I completely agree with you. It's just that I think we need to understand how it is exactly that we got so locked in on both sides. And it's not something that just came from the right in this particular case.
All right. We will continue to discuss that because obviously I disagree. But thank you all so much for watching today. It's been quite a week. Thanks for hanging with us on the Joe Rogan podcast. Such an incredible experience. Thanks again to Joe for having us there. And we're going to get some rest this weekend and be back in the studio for you on Monday. We got some great content to post over the weekend as well. Everybody enjoy your weekend and be safe out there.
See you guys.